name's Kim DuBreuil, and I am the associate pastor here, and I'm glad to be here with you this morning. Pastor Jeff is on vacation with the family. He'll be back tomorrow, I hope. Been holding down the fort. It's still here. That's good. Check. Well, this morning I want to look with you all at the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. We've looked at it for the last couple of weeks, and I want to take you to the third part of this trilogy parable here, verses 47 and 48. It says in our Bible, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that has been thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down, put the good into baskets, and threw the bad out." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, we have this group, these disciples who have met with Jesus. They're sitting along the shore, and Jesus approaches them and starts talking to them. Now, this net that we're talking about is not the kind that you would take out on your little boat and throw over the side and bring in some chum to fish with and use for bait. These are huge drag nets. They're dragged through the entire waters, and when they come up empty, it's not a good day. But when they come up full, then someone sits on shore and literally picks out the good fish that they can sell, and the bad fish they cast back into the water. So this is the image, and Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's trying to teach them about the kingdom of God. We also know it as the kingdom of heaven in the back of the book of Matthew. But they're one and the same. Well, Pastor Jeff and I, we sat down and we talked about what we were going to do for our first sermons, and he believed that it was good to let you know who we are, kind of tell you our story, share with you how it was that we ended up to be here with you. And Jeff talked to you about how the kingdom of heaven, or his call, was like that of a field and finding a treasure in a field. We also learned about how people will give up everything to sell it all to find that one pearl, that precious pearl, and how that we can find that in that oyster, and that's the second part of the trilogy. And today I hope to share with you how there's good and there's bad that comes into our lives, but when we cast our net on the right side of the boat with Jesus Christ, we will eventually get to the kingdom of heaven with one another. So here's my story. I grew up, born in Miami, so I'm a Florida native. I've lived here most of my life. I'll tell you about the journeys that I took elsewhere, but for the most part, I was raised in a Christian home, Christian parents, Christian education. Every day of the week, my mom and dad had me in some church somewhere. And I'll tell you, I took dance or cotillion on Thursdays at the Lutheran church, and it was Wednesday night at the Baptist church. Across the street was the Presbyterian church, and Sunday was MYF at First United Methodist of Coral Gables. Believe it or not, I grew up in the same church that your pastor, Philip, is now the pastor of. So you talk about God, right? Well, I grew up in that church, and so it was amazing to me. I ended up, eventually, our life changed a little bit. My parents divorced, and we moved to Lakeland, my mom and my brother and I. I was in 10th grade. And lo and behold, I end up at First Lakeland United Methodist Church, and my 12th grade Sunday school teacher ends up becoming my stepfather. You gotta meet someone, hey, a church is a good place to do it. So he introduces my brother and I to the University of Florida, his alma mater, and he and my brother and I should say, both majored in communications. Jim and Kim here. Jim lives in New York City. He's a producer for ABC News, and God is using my gift of speech communication to preach. So eventually life changes and we move. I get married, I go off to college and I marry, and after college, and I end up back in Coral Gables. Our pastor comes up to us after church and says, you know, we need to get some young people like you in the church. And I'm like, oh, well, yeah, I agree with that. So he invites us over to his house for burgers, along with several others. And I can still see Claire and Riley Short. Yep, Philip's dad. invites us over for burgers at the house, and he is the first person that introduces me to church leadership. And we start a young adult ministry and Sunday school class. We become a part of this growing church. I was involved in the youth group. I was involved on different committees, United Methodist Women. And eventually, though, I felt God was calling me to something more. I went to my first annual conference. I met this bishop who walked up to me, introduced himself, and said, "Now, what church are you the pastor of?" I was like, "Are you kidding me?" I started laughing really hard. I was like, "Right, I'm not the pastor of a church." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, not yet." I guess he had the gift of discernment. Well, that seemed to be the case with all the things that were going on in my life. Eventually, I went to see my new pastor. Now, the way I tell the story is that Riley Short was reappointed to First Lakeland, but really he just wanted to follow me there. I ended up coming to him one day and said, "You know, Riley, I really think that God is calling me into ministry. What should I do?" And he pulls out this little brochure and he says, "You're going to go to this single adult ministry conference in Garden Grove, California. And the church is going to pay for it." And I was like, "All right, free trip." So I go out there with my mom, and she went with me. Because one of the things that had happened recently in our lives, and he knew that we needed to get away, was the fact that my stepfather, my mom's husband, had passed away from pancreatic cancer. And it was just amazing to me because Ken and I would watch every Sunday Robert Schuller, The Hour of Power, at the Christian Cathedral in Garden Grove, and here Riley was sending me there because he knew. And I thought, gosh, what a great pastor. So we went. I came back. I ended up becoming the director of singles ministry at First Lakeland, and I served there for a number of years doing that. And again, I just felt called to something more. We ended up getting a new associate pastor. Her name was Sue Hoppert at the time. She's now Sue Hoppert Johnson, and she was just voted and became a bishop and is going to be in North Georgia. She was a delegate for our Florida conference and nominee. So she had this thing called a spiritual gift assessment that she was teaching. You've probably heard of those. And I took it, and she told me that, you've got some real good gifts in leadership, and you've got some good, gifts here. We need to really capitalize on that here in the church and for yourself. And needless to say, I'm going to lunch with her at Florida Southern College. I'm meeting the admissions director at Candler Theological Seminary. I'm praying to God, going, yes, I really feel called to ministry. This is it. This is great. I can't wait. But I went home, and it was the 80s, and I was a dink, double income, no kids. And I said no to God. I'd like to tell you that things continued on the way they do in life, but next thing you know, we end up in Washington, D.C. We lived there. 9/11 happens, anthrax, snipers on the streets of Washington. Didn't seem like the greatest move to make, but we did it. Eventually, our marriage of 18 years ended, and I knew I needed, again, to make some changes in my life. So I went to Georgetown University, and ended up becoming a paralegal. We left Washington, D.C., moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, my son and I. And Justin got involved in this sport that's real popular in Florida. No, I'm kidding. It's ice hockey. I was like, seriously, all the sports. Now I'm a single mom, and I'm finding myself in an ice rink every Sunday morning and not in a church. And I'm realizing that I'm surrounding myself around great people. I'm still faithful to God, and I'm still talking about God, but I really wasn't surrounding myself around kingdom people. Jesus tells us in this parable about separating the good from the bad. They weren't bad people, it wasn't the right thing for my life. So, Michigan was fun. I can tell you, we were involved in traveling all over the country playing hockey. I don't know if you ever remember Sarah Palin about that same time had this quote that she did, and I actually had a t-shirt made up. The only difference between a hockey mom and a pit bull lipstick. That was me, hockey mom, lipstick, the whole 9 yards. But one day I found myself, Justin had gone to visit his dad in Washington, D.C., and I'm out there with the dog in the snow. I was in my pajamas, and he's running around, and I'm ready to kill this dog because he takes off to the back of the house. I have my slippers on, and I'm running out there, no hat, no shoes, no socks. I'm starting to get cold, and I find this dog, and he's rolling around. It was a Sheltie, and he was having a great old time in the snow, but I'm winded at this point. So I sit down on this bench that's in the backyard, because we actually had water in the backyard of our house. We had ice hockey right there on a canal. Because if you're going to live and play ice hockey, the north is where you got to go to do that. So I remember feeling cold. I remember feeling numb on the outside. And I remember feeling how the numbness was penetrating my inner spirit. And I felt as numb on the inside as I did on the outside. And I wish I could tell you that my life was falling into place, but it wasn't. I remember getting up, going into the house, taking off my coat, and falling on the floor in the bedroom, sobbing, crying, telling God, I don't want to be here. I was angry. I don't want this life. I'm done. I'm done. I'm done. How many people have said that at some point in your life? Just done with it. Now, some of you may not believe this part of the story, but for me it was as real as you are sitting here with me today. I remember feeling like someone went over and picked me up off the floor, like one arm on each side. You know, like you would with your children, and you put them on a chair and say, now you sit here, you know. It was like that. And I felt this presence say to me, I mean, there's nobody there, but this presence say to me, will you trust me? Kimberly, will you trust me? And I could feel like these hands like were grabbing a hold of you, like to get your attention, you know, like you would a child. And I felt this presence just there. And then this calmness started coming over, and I started feeling more at ease. And I just realized that I wasn't alone in that room, that someone or something was there with me at that moment when I was calling out and needing God the most. And it was the first time in 15 years that I said, yes, Lord, I'll trust you. Amen. So I end up going home. I drive 22 miles from Michigan, or 22 hours to Michigan, from Michigan to Florida. And during each state, I went through a different state of mind. I mean, I got rid of hatred in Ohio, and Kentucky was full of rage, and Tennessee was disappointment, and by the time I got to Georgia, I was feeling a little better, and I crossed the Florida line, and I was a new person. I wish I could tell you it was that easy, but you get the idea. Well, I get home, and I remember having this conversation with my mom, and she said, when was the last time you went to church? Like all mothers do, right? And so we got in the car, we went to church, and I remember sitting there like you all are and looking at the newsletter, and I see this lighthouse on the front of the newsletter and the words that say, lead me. I thought, that's what I need. I need you, Lord, to lead me. So he did. He led me down the street to good friends. It was a contemporary worship service, so after church we went to visit with the family, the worship director of that contemporary service. And my mom looks at him and says, wait, how does she become a minister? And I thought, wow, God, yeah, how do I do that? And he said, well, you need to call the Florida Conference Office and talk to the Director of Clergy Excellence. His name is David Dodge. And I'm like, David Dodge, no way. He was my youth director at First United Methodist in Coral Gables. True story. So all I can tell you is everything started falling into place. I said yes to God, and everything started falling into place. I was talking to pastors, and they were leading me in the right direction. And before, on my way back, I had the dog in the car, and we stopped off at Candler Theological Seminary, and I met the admissions director, and then went on my way. I went back to Michigan, started looking for a church to get involved in. I did the church drive-bys, you know, like I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about. You didn't go in because it's too scary to walk through the door. I mean, I get that. So I did the church drive-by, and all of a sudden I get to this one, and there on the front, etched like you have out here, etched on the door was a lighthouse I was like, okay, well, I guess that's a sign from God. So I went in. I'd never been in the door before. It was during the day, and I said, can I speak to the pastor? And she looked at me and said, well, what's this about? And I said, it's a long story. I went in, I talked to Pastor Greg, and there in his office on the shelves were all these little replicas of lighthouses. And immediately I felt like I was at home, and that was where God wanted me to be at that moment. Well, I told him my story, and he said, all right, well, we're going to start meeting every Monday at 9 o'clock. And I'm going to be your mentor, and I'm going to help you get through this process of ordination. And so that's where the journey began. And about a month and a half later, he looks at me and he's like, okay, you ready to preach? I was like, are you serious? And he preached, and he's like, well, you said you're going to become a minister. That's kind of part of the deal. I went, oh. So meanwhile, I'm filling out all this paperwork, and I'm researching and trying to look at seminaries, and bringing my son up in Atlanta was I wasn't too sure about that, but I heard about how Asbury Theological Seminary that's in Kentucky has an Orlando campus, and something was calling me to go back home. Something was just saying, you need to go home. Well, Justin had a lot of friends, and needless to say, the fact that now he was going to have to tell his buddies that my mom wants to be a minister and we're moving, and I got to give up ice hockey was not what was on his, mind at that time. But I preached those first two sermons. It was Thanksgiving weekend, November 2011. And I got through them, and afterwards my son walked up to me and he said, Mom, I had no idea you could do that. If you want to go to Sarah Seminary, I'll support you. Wow. And that was all the affirmation I needed, and I thought, God, you are good. So, thank you. And so here I am. And I got up and I preached that sermon, and I want to say I nailed it, but I didn't. But I learned that when you preach different services, because there were two there's three here. I have no idea what I'm going to say next one. That the Holy Spirit just kind of moves you, and you just do it, and you realize that God is part of it all. And so we picked up. We got in a 26-foot. Big, bright yellow Penske moving truck. I had the car in tow, the dog and Justin, and it was a snowstorm in Michigan, and we left there. And I remember getting ready to adjust the rearview mirror, and I realized there are no rearview mirrors in a moving truck. And that meant there was no looking back. No looking back at the past. It was moving on. I was dropping my nets, like Jesus says in the Bible, to follow him. And that's what I did. Well, we moved to Florida. I had no idea where we were going to live, but I had trust and faith in God that he was going to provide, and he did. We found a great townhouse, and of course I made this mistake of saying to my son, oh, now when we get to Florida, we're going to live in Winter Park, and you're going to go to Winter Park High School. But I do believe in, you put it out there, and you go through the details, and you put it out there, and things will work out. And as it turns out, we did. We ended up in Winter Park in a townhouse, and the week after